Daniel's arrival changed the rhythm of the house immediately. Not with loud words or dramatic gestures, but with a quiet presence that filled the spaces left open by weeks of tension and unanswered questions. And Emma stood frozen for a moment. As she looked at him, noticing how familiar he felt despite the time apart, how his posture carried maturity shaped by loss, and how his eyes still held the same calm honesty that once made her feel safe. And when he spoke her name, softly, as if afraid it might break. The past rushed in without warning, bringing back long library nights, shared dreams spoken in low voices, and the gentle way he had always believed in her, even when she doubted herself. And they sat together at the kitchen table while her parents pretended to give them space, but listened carefully from the next room. And Daniel explained without pride or expectation that after his father passed away, he had been left with money. He never wanted money that felt heavy until he found a purpose for it. And when he learned about the foundation and remembered Emma's dedication, her struggles, her stubborn hope, he knew exactly where it belonged, and Emma listened with tears. In her eyes, not because of the money, but because someone had seen her journey clearly enough to invest in it without asking for anything back. And the realization settled deep in her chest, warming places that had been cold for years. And as they talked, the awkward distance between them slowly disappeared, replaced by an easy understanding that came from shared history and mutual respect. And when Daniel apologized for leaving so suddenly years ago, Emma admitted how much it had hurt, how she had told herself she was fine, while quietly carrying the loss like an unanswered question. And instead of reopening wounds, the honesty eased them, smoothing the sharp edges of old pain into something manageable and human. And outside, the evening light softened, casting long shadows across the room as if time itself had slowed too. Listen, and Emma's parents finally joined them, thanking Daniel with voices full of emotion, realizing that the man sitting across from them had altered their daughter's future in ways they could never repay. And Daniel responded humbly, saying he had only done what felt right, that believing in Emma had always been easy. And that belief became the foundation of something new as days passed and conversations deepened, and Emma began preparing for her move to Boston, sorting books, closing chapters, saying goodbyes. While Daniel stayed in touch, offering help without pressure, support without conditions, and their connection grew naturally, built on patience rather than urgency. And one afternoon, as Emma walked through campus one last time, she realized she no longer felt the ache she once carried from graduation day, because the meaning of that moment had shifted, transformed from abandonment into understanding, from disappointment into gratitude. And she stopped by the empty gym, now quiet and ordinary, and smiled softly, knowing that important moments did not always look important at first. And when her departure day arrived, her family stood with her at the train station, holding her close, pride shining openly this time, and Daniel stood a little apart, respecting the moment until Emma reached for his hand, making it clear that he belonged there too. And as the train pulled away, she looked out at the people. She loved feeling steady instead of scared, confident instead of uncertain, because she was carrying more than ambition with her. She was carrying proof that love could be quiet and still powerful, that belief could arrive without applause, and that sometimes the most meaningful support came not from the crowd, but from the ones who stayed when no one was watching. And as the city disappeared behind her, Emma opened her bag and touched the folded letter once more. Not because she needed reassurance, but because it reminded her of how far she had come, and in the months that followed, Stone challenged her in ways she expected, and surprised her in ways she did not. And through every long study night and demanding lecture, she felt grounded by the knowledge that she was not alone, that her story was shaped not by one missed day, but by years of love, sacrifice, and quiet faith. And when Daniel visited, walking beside her through unfamiliar streets, their conversations turned toward the future, cautious but hopeful, built on understanding rather than fantasy, and Emma realized that romance did not always arrive with intensity. Sometimes it grew slowly, deeply, like trust rebuilt on honesty and time. And standing beside him one evening as the city lights reflected in the river, Emma felt a calm certainty settle in her heart. Knowing that while her family had missed one moment, they had never missed believing in her. And while love had once slipped through her fingers, it had returned stronger, gentler, and real. And in that balance of past and present, Emma found her true graduation, not marked by a ceremony, but by the quiet confidence of knowing she was exactly where she was, meant to be. The evening after graduation moved quietly, but Emma Parker felt every minute press against her chest as if time itself wanted answers. And when she finally sat on her bed with the envelope resting in her hands, the room felt smaller, closer, filled with memories of years spent chasing a dream that often felt too big for someone like her. And she opened the envelope slowly, half expecting disappointment, half afraid of hope. And as her eyes moved across the page, the world around her seemed to fade because the words did not feel real. The letter spoke of selection, of recognition, of opportunity, and when she reached the line that said her graduate education would be fully funded, including tuition, housing, and support, she had to read it again, then a third time, because no one in her family had ever received something like this. No one had ever opened a letter that promised freedom from fear about money, and her hands shook as she read the final lines, the handwritten note at the bottom written with care and belief, telling her someone believed in her deeply. And Emma pressed the letter to her chest as tears finally fell. Not loud or messy, but quiet and heavy. The kind that carried years of struggle and silent hope. And she laughed softly through the tears because the timing felt almost cruel, receiving the greatest news of her life on the same day she had never felt more alone. And as the sun set outside her window, her phone rang at last, her mother's name lighting the screen, and Emma answered without anger, only concern, because the sound of Linda's voice was unsteady, rushed, apologetic, explaining through broken sentences that Emma's grandmother had collapsed that morning, that the hospital calls had come suddenly, that panic had erased everything else. And Emma listened carefully, her heart pulling in two directions at once because relief mixed with disappointment. And she told her mother she understood because she did. Because family emergencies did not follow calendars. And when Linda promised they were on their way, Emma felt the tension ease just enough to breathe. And when Robert and Jake arrived, later that night, exhausted and full of guilt, the house filled with voices again, apologies layered with worry, and Emma hugged them all, realizing that the pain of being forgotten hurt less than the fear of losing someone. And as they sat together in the small living room, Emma placed the letter on the table without ceremony. And it was Robert who picked it up, his brows pulling together as he read, his lips parting slightly at the official seal. At the words that confirmed everything, and the room went silent as he finished, his eyes shining not with pride alone, but with shock, because he had never imagined a future that looked this wide for his daughter. And Linda covered her mouth, tears forming as she whispered Emma's name like a prayer. And Jake stared at his sister like he was seeing her for the first time. And in that moment, the graduation they had missed found a different form. One quieter and more powerful, unfolding in a small living room instead of a crowded gym. And yet one question lingered, unspoken but heavy, because the handwritten note remained unexplained. The absence of a signature standing out more than any official stamp. And Emma admitted she did not know who had written it, only that someone had believed enough to help without being seen, and Robert's expression shifted from pride to reflection as he realized the calls from unknown numbers weeks ago, the paperwork that had come asking about Emma's background. The interviews they had brushed off as routine suddenly made sense, and Linda felt a weight lift and settle all at once. Understanding that someone else had been quietly watching over Emma's path, and that thought stayed with Emma through the night as sleep came slowly, her mind replaying faces from the past, teachers who had encouraged her, advisors who had pushed her harder than others, friends who had once believed in her dreams. And one face that returned again and again was Daniel Reed's. A name she had not spoken out loud in a long time. Someone who had known her before the confidence, before the certainty. Someone who had seen her doubt and stayed gentle with it. And she pushed the thought away, telling herself not to imagine stories where there were none. Because life had taught her not to expect quiet miracles, tied to old feelings. And the next few days passed quickly as hospital visits eased, her grandmother's condition stabilized, and the family found a new balance between relief and exhaustion. But the letter stayed visible on the kitchen counter, like a promise that refused to be hidden. And friends began calling to congratulate Emma after hearing the news through the university, their voices full of excitement, their words full of possibilities, and still, the mystery of the letter lingered, creating a quiet tension that followed Emma everywhere. And when a knock finally came at the door one afternoon, soft but certain, Emma opened it without expectation, only curiosity, and there stood Daniel, older but familiar, holding himself with a calm that came from surviving loss and choosing kindness anyway, his eyes meeting hers with a softness that made her breath catch. And before either of them spoke, Emma understood. Because sometimes the truth arrives without needing explanation, and Daniel confirmed it gently, telling her he had never stopped believing in her. That when his life had changed suddenly, he had wanted to do something that mattered, something that honored what they once shared. And Emma listened as emotions collided inside her. Gratitude, surprise, affection, and a tender ache for what had almost been lost forever. And as her family watched quietly from behind, understanding settling into their faces, Emma realized that while her graduation day had begun with absence, it was now filled with meaning she could never have planned, and the future stretched before her not just as a path of success, but as a reminder that love in its quiet forms often showed up exactly when it was needed most. The morning of Emma Parker's graduation began with a strange stillness that she could not explain. A quiet that felt too heavy for a day meant to celebrate endings and beginnings. And as she stood in front of her mirror adjusting the blue cap that kept sliding over her eyes, she checked her phone again, expecting a message from her mother saying they were on the way or stuck in traffic or laughing about some small mistake. But the screen stayed blank. And she told herself not to read into it because her family was not the kind to forget important things. Especially not this. Especially not after all the years they had talked about this day like it was a shared victory rather than just hers. So she picked up her gown, stepped outside into the mild spring air, and walked toward the campus gym with a fast pace in her steps and a slow ache in her chest that she kept ignoring. Reminding herself that mornings were always rushed, and that the parking near the university was terrible, and that any minute now her phone would buzz and everything would feel normal again. But when she reached the gym and saw families already lined up, smiling, holding flowers, adjusting cameras, that ache grew sharper, and it stayed with her as she lined up with other graduates, each of them talking loudly, laughing, pointing out their parents in the crowd while Emma stood quiet, scanning the rows of chairs again and again, telling herself she was just early, telling herself she was being dramatic, telling herself that love did not disappear without reason. Yet the minutes passed quickly, the ceremony began. And still those 3 seats with the small white card-reading Parker family remained painfully empty. And Emma felt embarrassment settle over her like a second gown, because it was one thing to miss a class or a dinner, but another to miss a moment like this, and she wondered who was watching her now, who noticed the way she kept looking toward the same spot, who might think she had no one, when in truth she had always believed she had everything. And as the speeches went on, long and proud, she tried to focus on the words about hard work and perseverance. But her mind kept drifting back to memories of her parents working late shifts, of her father Robert fixing old appliances to save money, of her mother Linda leaving encouraging notes on the fridge, of her younger brother Jake teasing her about being the smart one. And the contrast between those memories and the empty chairs felt cruel, like a story that had suddenly skipped a chapter. And by the time the names were called, Emma's nerves had turned into something steady and cold. Because disappointment had a way of hardening when it went on too long, and when she heard her own name echo through the gym, she stood automatically, walked across the stage, accepted the diploma with a polite smile, and heard the applause that followed. Applause meant for her, applause she should have soaked in, but it felt distant, hollow, as if it belonged to someone else. And she caught herself imagining her family running in late, breathless, waving from the back, but no one did. And when the ceremony ended and graduates poured outside into the sunlight, Emma found herself standing alone near the edge of the crowd, watching families cry and hug and laugh, watching parents hold their children like they were afraid to let go, and she thought about how she had imagined this moment so many times. How she pictured her mother's tears, her father's proud smile, Jake pretending not to care but snapping. Pictures anyway, and the difference between that dream and this reality made her throat tighten. And she turned away before anyone could notice the shine in her eyes, deciding she would walk back to her apartment instead of waiting, because waiting suddenly felt worse than being alone. And as she walked, her phone remained silent in her hand, heavier with every step, until she reached a quiet bench near the old library and sat down, letting the weight of the day finally settle. And it was there that she noticed the envelope inside her bag, thick and pale, with her name written neatly across the front. An envelope she had seen earlier that morning, slipped under her door, which she had ignored in the rush and tension of getting dressed. And now, with nothing else demanding her attention, she pulled it out and turned it over slowly, noticing the careful handwriting, the unfamiliar return address, the way the paper felt more serious than a casual letter, and she wondered briefly if it was another rejection or a reminder of something unpaid, because her life had taught her not to expect surprises without strings. And yet something about it felt different, heavier, like it carried news that had waited patiently for her to be still enough to receive it. And for a moment she considered opening it right there on that bench, with the sound of distant laughter floating across campus, but she stopped herself, telling herself that some things deserved privacy, that some moments needed space, and she slipped it back into her bag, stood up, and continued walking home with a strange sense that the day was not finished with her yet, even if it had already taken more than she thought it would. And by the time she reached her apartment, the sun had shifted, the noise had faded, and the quiet returned, that same quiet from the morning, now deeper and more personal. And she dropped her cap on the chair, hung the gown carefully like a promise she was not ready to unwrap, and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall, replaying unanswered questions in her mind, wondering why no one had called, wondering if something was wrong, wondering how a day meant to feel full could feel so empty instead. And though she did not know it yet, this loneliness, this silence, this pause before understanding, was the first step in a story that would change the meaning of family, success, and love in her life forever.